I was glad when they said to me, "Let us go to the house of the Lord," Psalm 122:1.
We are glad, whether we drove in or climbed up, whether we logged on or tuned in. We are glad to be here in this community with this family. It is a place of joyful hope, of radical welcome. It is a place where together we can wait in wondrous anticipation of the kingdom to come.
Many people shall come and say, "Come, let us go up the mountain of the Lord to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways and that we may walk in his paths." Isaiah 2, verse 3.
We light this candle as a sign of our hope, our joyous hope that we can be restored, our faith restored, our strength restored, our confidence restored, our joy restored, as we watch and wait with all God's people for the promise to be fulfilled.
Good morning. Hope and expectation. Last week we were talking about husbands and wives, and when you end up getting married, one of the things that often happens is you have children and you get pregnant. So this whole Christmas season, as we celebrate hope and expectation, even for Mary and Joseph, there was this hope and expectation of the fulfillment of God's promise. However, there's probably a little bit more involved in that as they were looking forward to having this child. It was like, what are we going to do? How are we going to raise this child? Not only how are we going to raise a child, but how are we going to raise the Son of God? I mean, that was probably a really big expectation and a weight on their shoulders. You realize that there are 50,000 plus parenting books on Amazon today? 50,000 of them. And we still can't get it right, That's why they sell. We're so afraid of messing up our children that we grab the latest topic and hope for some insight in what they can give us. I wasn't sure about wanting children after I started reading certain titles like Parenting Isn't for Cowards or Strong-Willed Child. This is the new one. I mean, forget about the old one. The strong-willed child, and you're kind of like, how am I going to do this? How are we going to raise children in a world that just seems to be in such chaos? I was just hoping my parents would have read this one, The Whole Brain Child. All my life, my brothers called me a half-witted brain. But we look for answers, and when we're looking for the right one, we need to go to Andy Stanley because he's got it. Parenting, getting it right. And of course, when we understand that he doesn't have it all right, we might be able to get the 15-minute parenting book and realize that that's all it takes is 15 minutes. But even in there, we realize that our culture is falling apart. But that's okay. If our culture is falling apart, we can go to the Danes and parent their way. They are the happiest people in the world. Well, parenting is like marriage. If you are going to do it right, you need to both be looking through the same lens. And we typically parent the way our parents parented us. That wasn't good for us, at least from my perspective, and I didn't want to parent like my parents. And so Rebecca and I needed to have that same lens through which we looked to, and that was the Scriptures. So this morning, if you would turn to our passage in Colossians chapter 3, 20 and 21, we're going to be looking at that passage about fathers specifically and their children. And it reads like this. Children, okay, everybody listening? Children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. Fathers, do not provoke your children, lest they become discouraged. Now, to understand what Paul is talking about in this passage, we need to go back into history and find out what it was that parenting looked like in that first century in Rome and in Greece, and then, of course, in the Jewish mindset. So just for you to understand, children at that time were legally the property of their fathers. Their status, theoretically, was a little better than slaves. Now, a slave, he was taunting, or he was being taunted by by the free son. And so he made this comment to the free son. He said, "Perhaps you do not know that in many states," this is in the Roman state, "which have exceedingly good laws, fathers may even imprison or sell them, their sons. And they have a power even more terrible than any of these, for they actually are allowed to put their sons to death without any trial or even without bringing any accusation against them." So in the early Roman Empire, a father had total rule and authority over his children, and he could even put them to death. Now, Epictetus observes this as the duty of a son. He is to treat everything that is his own as belonging to his father, to be obedient to him in all things, never to speak ill of him to anyone else, or to say or do anything that will harm him, to give way to him in everything and yield to his presence, helping him even as far as within his power. And so that is what he is supposed to do. The son is to give everything to his father. Now, it's unusual to break away from that type of mindset when you grew up in it. So the command to children to obey their parents in our passage really fit with the universal expectation of the Roman Empire. However, it was unusual for someone to address a child directly, as if they were independent or responsible subjects. And so our passage says that children, he's speaking to them directly, are to obey their parents in everything. It was really a variation of the command to honor their father and their mother. The command takes for granted, however, that the parents are not going to do anything that is not in the best interest of the child. In fact, Jesus said, if a child asks for a fish, as a parent, you're not going to give them a stone. And so even though children were to be obedient in everything, there was an expectation on the parents to do what was right for the child. But children, their duty to their parents is transformed into obedience, not just to the Father, but really to the Lord. Paul emphasizes that a child's pleasing the Lord is what is the central aspect of the obedience, not to the parents. He is to owe his obedience to his relationship with Christ first. And that relationship with Christ surpasses the relationship with his parents, and his father in particular. So being obedient to their fathers, the children are really being obedient to the Lord. And of course, Christ is our example in that, and how he was obedient to the Father, even over being obedient to his mother. Now, fathers then are addressed in the next command. Now, it's interesting that he does not address mothers, and he doesn't use a broader term in terms of parents. And the reason for that is because fathers had absolute control over the lives of their children, even when they were grown and married. One writer of that time, he remarked this. He said, "The lawgiver of the Romans gave virtually full power to the father over his son, whether he thought proper to imprison him, to scourge him, to put him in chains and keep him at work in the fields, or to put him to death. And this, even though the son were engaged in public affairs, though he were numbered among the highest magistrates, and though he were celebrated for his zeal for the commonwealth." No matter how old he was, even if he was popular and involved in the community as an adult, his father still had authority over them. And it only ended when the father either emancipated his son or one of the two of them died. Now, the attitudes toward disciplining children in the ancient world, it varied just as much as it varies today. For some, ruling with an iron hand was the norm. But there was one author, Quintilian, he contended that physical punishment inflicts shame and breaks the heart. Others complained, as though they have throughout the ages, that too much permissiveness allows the younger generation too much latitude to make mistakes, and so you need to rein them in. Now, Paul, in our passage, in Corinthians, he identified with them as their father. And so he's trying to deal with their disobedience. The Corinthians are disobedient in something, so Paul writes to them, and he gives this illustration of the slave servant. Now, the slave servant in a Roman family looked after the oldest son. And so he would follow him around. He would actually discipline him. He would follow him to school, bring him back from home in such a way that servant guardian started to be depicted as somebody that had a lot of anger and really harsh and discipline. And so on a lot of Greek vases, what you'll find is the servant guardian with a stick. And then in some of the plays, he was pictured as someone who was not only harsh, but stupid as well. So Paul picks up on this image when he's talking to the Corinthians, and he says to them, he says, "Shall I come to you with a whip?" Or literally a rod. In other words, should I come to you like a guard and servant? Or should I show you love and a gentle spirit as a father would? So Paul expected obedience from his children, his spiritual children of the Corinthians, but he believed that the father's discipline should be tempered with love and compassion and kindness and patience. So Paul, he really identifies more with Quintilian's view of a more lax view of discipline than he did of the harsh, austere issues of that day. In fact, he felt that if a person had too much authority and power, like the father did in the Roman Empire, is that he would use it in such a way that it would be harmful to people. So he is telling them to soften it up, to not be so harsh. Pliny, a church father, wrote to a friend cautioning him about discipline. He said this, he said, "I was remembered by this example of excessive severity to write to you, as one friend to another, lest you on some occasion treat your son too harshly and strictly. Remember that he's a boy, and that you were once a boy, and perform your duty as a father, always remembering that you are a human being and the father of a human being." Paul has a greater concern over the severity of the discipline of parents than he's worried about children's disobedience. He's more concerned about how fathers might push their kids away from the faith than he is about children's obedience. Now, that's the Greek and Roman world, but what did the Jewish people of that time think about discipline? Well, Syriac, writing in 200 to 175 BC, gives us a different view of it. He offers advice on parental discipline that differs considerably from Paul's. He says a father who loves his son should whip him often. He also tells us, bow down on his neck in his youth and beat his sides while he is young. Sometimes, you kind of wonder whether you should do it or not, right? But Syriac reflects that widespread assumption of the Jewish parent in that century. But it does reflect a little bit of the Old Testament. It says in Proverbs, "My son, do not despise the Lord's discipline or be wary of his reproof, for the Lord reproves him who he loves, as a father the son in whom he delights." So the Lord disciplines his children. In fact, it continues in Proverbs 23, "Do not withhold discipline from a child. If you strike him with a rod, he won't die. Spare the rod, spoil the child." So we might say, yes, but that's the Old Testament view of it. Well, the writer to Hebrews, he says it is for discipline that you have to endure. God is treating you as a son. For what son is there whom his father does not discipline? If you are left without discipline, in which all have participated, then you are an illegitimate child. And so there's this idea that that discipline is a necessary part of parenting. Well, yes, but that was the writer of Hebrews. Well, the English Puritan Bartholomew Batty, he argued this. I thought this was very interesting. He said that God created the buttocks for children to receive just correction with stripes and blows without causing serious bodily harm. Now we know. Now, Paul doesn't really align himself with the contemporary idea of discipline of his time. He reflects more on a new insight in the New Testament, which appreciates a child's point of view and his feelings. The apostle worries more about the discouragement of the child, that he's not bowed down over and broken. He knows the danger that the one invested with the final word and total authority may misuse that authority in destructive ways. His concern is not that children will grow up to disgrace the father but by their disobedience, but that the father will hinder the nurturing of his children through discipline at all costs. Now we have this, we have even in our culture this dichotomy of how we should raise children. Are we to be stern with our discipline, or are we to be lax? Well, this is what one person says, is that constant criticism and reprimand can be as destructive as none at all and can destroy a child's sense of worth. So that harsh discipline, or what he will say later is beating children, will only teach them to be violent themselves. That's one side of it. The other side says, no, we need to discipline our children in a more stern way, lest they become unwilling and permissive. So which is it? Well, Winthau is a behavior scientist, and he did research on how children learn to care for people outside of their family. And what he observed is that children learn how to care by watching their parents care for one another. So if parents are acting in kind ways towards people, then they will pick that up and they will start acting kindly towards people as well. And that was his observation. However, there has been other research that has shown is that really doesn't make any difference, that children will make a decision of their own according to their own best interest. That's why we have 50,000 books on how to parent children. It is confusing. So I want to give you the definitive answer on how to raise children, the way Rebecca and I did. Now, Rebecca was the more compassionate in our family, and I was the more harsh. So we decided to find a family that we looked at and saw they had well-adjusted children from our perspective, and we wanted to align our discipline the way they did. And so out of that, 3 principles really came into play for us. And it was these: that discipline should be consistent, loving, and disciplined. We'll get to that in a minute. So what does it mean to have consistent discipline? Well, what it means is every situation is different. Even if the infraction is the same, the situation is always different. Did it happen in the morning or the evening? Was I tired or well rested? Was it in front of people or in private? We had to generally know what we were going to do ahead of time so that when in any given situation, we wouldn't react, but then act in a very healthy way. So we wanted to make sure that it was not out of emotion. Now, was it willful disobedience, or was it disobedience out of ignorance? You might, well, what's the difference? Well, willful disobedience is when I know what the rule is and I disobey it anyway. Ignorance is when I, as a parent, have not explained the discipline or the infractions or whatever, and my children get involved. I'll give you an example. Now, when I prepared this, I didn't realize my son was going to be here. Here goes, buddy. Okay, so David goes in, this is when he was younger, goes into his mom, says, can I borrow the hose? Can I use the hose? Mom's down in the basement working on the computer, says, sure. What harm could there be in using the hose? The hose was a safety mechanism for the fire they were building. All right, so they built this fire on a bicycle ramp, and they piled up cardboard and with lighter fluid set it on fire and rode their bicycles through it. Now, we know this because they videotaped it. We have this on tape. And across the street, the mother walks out and yells at her son, Caleb, what are you doing? Which he responds, David's mom said it was okay. We didn't find out about it until they were editing the video and we were watching it. Now, I had never told David that he could not set his bicycle ramp on fire and jump through it. So if I had that expectation, he did it out of ignorance, not out of willful disobedience. The only thing that he could no longer do was use matches. Caleb did. So willful disobedience. So you have to decide, is it ignorance or is it willful disobedience? And you have to be consistent with that. It has to be consistent in what you do. So you have to know these different things and how will you apply your discipline in any one of these gifts. But whatever you decide, you have to be consistent at it. You may decide that you're going to ground your children. You may decide that you're going to spank your little child. But whatever you're going to do, you need to be consistent with it, because when you're not consistent in your discipline, then it confuses children, and then they don't know what to expect. The second principle is loving discipline, which simply means is that you don't discipline children because you're angry or you're embarrassed or mistreated or offended. We discipline children that they will grow up to be mature, godly men and women. And so we are looking at disciplining them in such a way that will correct their behavior so that they are more like Jesus. So when you go into the store and your son or your child starts crying, and you feel embarrassed because there are people around you, and so you get after your child and you discipline, well, that's not loving, because you're doing it out of your own selfish interests. You know, did they embarrass me? And so you have to figure out whether you're disciplining in love or in reaction to an emotional thing. Love always disciplines, but it disciplines in a way that is beneficial for the child and not necessarily for the parent. So it needs to be loving. So consistent and loving. And the third principle is it needs to be disciplined. Discipline simply means that the consequences for their infraction results in an appropriate response. Some parents ignore their children. Sometimes it's easier to ignore your child than it is to discipline, because discipline takes effort and forethought and energy, and you're at the end of the day and you just don't care anymore. And so when they get into trouble, you don't do anything, and therefore you're inconsistent and it's not loving. And so you have to discipline your children even when you don't want to, even when it's hard. Now, fortunately for us and my son, you know, not like the Roman Empire where he's still under my authority. Now he gets to do what he wants to do, and he does it very well. And I contribute that to Rebecca's parenting style. He was her favorite. No, not right. So what our passage says then is, fathers, don't exasperate your children. So I have 8 ways that parents can exasperate their children. Now, this isn't a how-to. This is a how not to, all right? The first one is make promises that you don't keep. That will frustrate your children. And I know that I did this many times. Oh, sure, we'll go out and do that. Sure, we're going to do that. And I never really intended to do it. Or circumstances in life come up, and so we don't do it. Now, Rebecca and I disagreed on these things. Rebecca would say, you make a promise, you keep it no matter what. And I was more like, you make a promise and you plan to keep it, but as circumstances change, well, you can't always keep the promise. Well, if I look back, I would rather be on her side of it than my side, because my side would be inconsistent all the way down the line. And I would probably give up because my own selfish interest would always come first. And so in order to not frustrate our children, we need to make sure that when we give a promise that we follow through with it. Otherwise, they get exasperated and they become distant to us because they'll never believe us. If you give your word, follow through with it. The second one is nag them to death, or always finding fault. Now, nagging, as I define it, is the truth over and over and over again. And it's hard because we have this balance we have to keep, because we all want our children to grow up to be responsible and hardworking and disciplined young men and women. And so how do you build that into them? Well, you correct them all the time. Right? And so they would say that, well, you're nagging me. But this is where I find the nagging is most prevalent, and that's when we're finding fault all the time. It's when they can never do anything to measure up. And you're just nagging them because they can't measure up to your high expectations. Now, sometimes they can, and they just need a good, swift, you need to do it. But sometimes we do it because we want them to be like us and not like them. And that will exasperate them to no end. You'd be nagging like, get off your phone and get into the books. Maybe they had been in the books and you just walked in while they're on the phone. You're lazy. You'll never be successful with an attitude like that. It may be true, but how should you come about telling them that? You have a lot of potential if you just simply apply yourself. And those are all true statements, but the question is how do you tell your children in such a way that motivates them to change their behavior to be more like Christ? Thirdly is micromanaging them. Now, this can happen when they're little. This is the way it worked for me. Oh, you want some help with that? Let me help you. You're not doing that right. Let me help you. No, let me just do that. No, you're just going to mess it up. Just go over there and play while I finish this. And Rebecca will walk in, and I'll say, hey, Rebecca, look what we did. And we didn't do anything. I did it all. And so a lot of times in our lives with our children, we tend to micromanage them to the point where they are pushed aside and not doing anything because we take over. I told you to wash the car. All you're doing is smearing the dirt around. Let me show you how to do that. My brother did that once to me, and I thought, hey, not a bad idea. I'll let you do it all the time. So the next one is unrealistic expectations. Unrealistic expectations. This is the kind of thing where we say, you need to have straight A's all the time in school. Now, maybe they can have straight A's at time, and their just need is a little motivation. But if it's an expectation that they cannot meet, then it is unrealistic. Or you should be in a good mood all the time. I'm not in a good mood all the time. How could I expect my children to be in a good mood all the time? You should love everything that I put in front of you to eat. Now, that's different than you should eat everything that I put in front of you, but that they should love it is a different thing. So when we have undue expectations, that just frustrates our kids. So we need to know our children as well as ourselves. Fifthly, to show partiality. That's when you say, well, I have favorites. Now, and come on, everybody, we have favorites, don't we? Or maybe it's like this. There are certain children in which we relate to more readily than the other ones. Not that we have favorites, but that, I'll give you an example. This is not something I'm just going, hey, I'm proud about this. We used to play paintball all the time. And I had two boys who loved playing paintball. I spent a lot of time with them playing paintball. My other son, my middle son, does not like paintball. He's a musician. He's sensitive. Doesn't like getting hit with a ball. But I don't know anything about music. And so it's not like he and I could just sit down and jam together. And so he came to me one day and said, I think you like them better than I like you. Than you like me. And I said, no, son, that's not it. So I had to figure out a way to enter into his world in the areas that he liked the most. So I became his roadie for his band. But it was different. It's not that I like the other two better. I just related to them a little bit easier. And so to my middle son, it looked like partiality. And when that happens, we frustrate our children terribly. And it can naturally happen. So be careful as your children are growing up. Be inconsistent. This goes back to the consistency part. If you're inconsistent in your discipline and the things that you promise, they're going to be confused, especially as young children, and they don't know what to expect. And that creates problems and behavior problems. 7, design punishments that far exceed the nature of the infraction. I know some parents who spank children for everything. Now, we spanked our children. We had a very defined categories. We spanked our children for willful disobedience. So you had to know what was willful and what was ignorant and what was accidental or what, but you had to know, was it willful disobedience? We would spank our children. We would spank our children. We'd give them no more than 3 swats at a time, So no more than 3 swats. 3 was the high end. And so that's the only time that we spanked them. And then as they got older, spanking got less and less and less because they became more obedient as they got older as well. Now, I don't take my son out and spank him. He would beat me up, So he's just bigger than I am. He's stronger. So I got to know my own limitations. So the punishment needs to fit the crime. And so we need to be careful of that. That means forethought, thinking about how we're going to do that. 8. Ignoring them. It's easy to ignore children. A child is best seen and unheard, But when they're unheard and you ignore them, it frustrates them because children desire to have relations. We were watching this video the other day, and it was about this whole thing. It was about this baby, and he was connecting with her father. It was a TED Talk done by a 12-year-old girl, and she's showing this thing about her little brother and the father, and the baby just loved it. And the more attention he gave to her, the more happy and well-adjusted the baby was. He then started to ignore the baby. So the baby would come over and try to climb in his lap, and he just plainly ignored it, started crying and fussing and sitting down and throwing a tantrum. All to show that when you ignore children, they become frustrated. And they want our attention. They want our attention. But if you ignore them, they will eventually go, I don't want your attention any longer. Ignore them when they're small. They will not pay attention to you when they're older, unless the Lord gets a hold of them. Why does Paul say this about exasperating our children? Because he knows that in doing so, we will push them away from Christ. Parenting isn't for cowards, but it is for us as people. And so, fathers, we have this great responsibility to be very involved with our children. It's not something that we hand over to our wives. It is something that we are engaged in. Grandparents, it is a challenge to parent your grandchildren or to parent your adult children with your grandchildren. I mean, frankly, don't we love our grandchildren a little bit more than our children? It's just the nature of things, because we can send them home at the end of the day. But we have a responsibility there as well to encourage and to support our children in the raising of their children. So we don't contradict our children when they discipline our grandchildren, because that would exasperate the children, and my children, and of course my grandchildren as well. This morning we're having a baptism, and it is of a young lady whose parents have worked very diligently to raise her to be a godly young woman. And God has gotten a hold of her heart, and she has decided to make a decision to exhibit her faith in front of us as her family through baptism. So if Abby would come up, right, Abby, and Rachel and Paul. Paul here. So, Abby, would you like to use this? Not this. Okay.
Hello, my name is Abby. I was born in a Christian family. As a child, I said the prayer many times. I asked God to be in my heart and that I wanted a relationship with him. But I didn't understand really how awesome he is until later. So I would like to share with you a couple of instances in which God revealed himself to me clearly. The 5th grade was when I started to see how awesome God was and how much I actually needed him in my life. In the 5th grade, there were some lies going around about me. These lies continued to grow until they got so bad that during lunch one day, my friends brought me out into the hall and told me that they told the guidance counselor about some things I had supposedly said about them. They told me she said I needed to stop talking bad about people. When I got back in the cafeteria, I was crying because I hadn't said anything bad about anybody. My sister saw me crying, and I still remember the first thing she said to me when she came down to talk to me. She said, "Who do I need to punch?" I told her she didn't need to punch anyone, and she tried to cheer me up. When I got home that day, I was talking to my mom, and she told me to pray about it and go to God with it. So I did. Over the next few days, everything at school returned mostly to normal. That was the first time I realized really how awesome God was. That was when I actually accepted Christ and asked God into my heart. I realized that God can use something that seemed so horrible at the time, like middle school gossip, to bring us to him. He will also provide anything or anybody you may need to help get you through whatever you're going through. In this case, my mom and even my sister. Over the years, I have had 12 teeth pulled. The first time I had to get some teeth pulled, I was nervous, but not too much. The second time, I don't know why, but I was even more nervous than the first time. The night before I was going to get some teeth pulled for the second time, I couldn't sleep, so I got out of bed and went to the kitchen where my mom was and started crying. We sat down in front of the fridge, and she read Philippians 4:6. Do not be anxious about everything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. Then we prayed about it together, and I went to bed and fell asleep. Since then, God has put even more great people in my life that have helped me grow in my faith. I now have lots of people to talk to if I need to talk about anything. Another thing that has helped me grow in my faith is mission trips and just going to Sunday night youth groups. A few months ago, one of my friends got baptized, and I kind of started thinking about if I wanted to be baptized. Then a while later, my cousin got baptized. Then Pastor Paul mentioned something about baptism in one of his sermons. So I was still praying about it. Then a friend asked me if I'm going to get baptized this year. After that, I still didn't know if I wanted to get baptized, so one night I seriously said, God, if you want me to get baptized, have another person mention baptism to me. The very next day, I had another friend just out of the blue say, have you ever thought about being baptized? I prayed about it more and decided to be baptized. But believe it or not, I was still not completely convinced I was ready to be baptized. But after meeting with Rachel, I was completely convinced. She showed me many examples in the Bible of when people get baptized right away after they are saved and put their faith in Jesus. I wanted to get baptized because I know that God is holy and awesome and created us to be with him. But sin messed everything up. But then God sent his one and only Son so we could have a relationship with him. Jesus died for us. He took the penalty that was meant for us. We were meant to die, but Jesus took that penalty. He shed his blood on the cross for our sins so that we may have a relationship with him. In order to truly have a relationship with God, we have to believe in Jesus Christ. Baptism was commanded by Jesus. In order to be obedient to Christ, I need to get baptized. So here I am now.
Dear Heavenly Father, you are an awesome, awesome God. You are a holy, perfect God. And yet, we are messed up sinners in need of a Savior. And through your love, your sacrificial love, you sent your Son, Jesus Christ, to this earth to live a sinless life and to take the punishment we deserved. Lord, I thank you for this beautiful picture of baptism, of Christ's death and resurrection on the cross, for the life Abby can now live as your child. I thank you for the miracle you've done in her life, for how you have drawn her into relationship with you. And Lord, may you continue to grow in her and use her for your kingdom. In your wonderful name, amen.